Say hello to everyone. My name is Patrick Siegler-Lathrop. I'm president of the American Club of Lisbon. Good morning to our friends in North America. I'm particularly happy to welcome students and teachers from Indian Springs, a high school near Birmingham, Alabama, where both our honored guests and I graduated, although obviously quite a few years apart, as all of you can guess. Good afternoon to our friends in Europe. I'm happy to welcome members of the American Club of Lisbon, and also to welcome members from other American clubs, part of the Association of American Clubs. Let me quickly start with a summary introduction of our speaker that I am just absolutely so thrilled that she was kind enough to give of her time for this session. So Elaine Luria was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama. After attending Indian Springs School, she went on to graduate from the Naval Academy and then to serve for 20 years in the Navy, rising to the rank of commander, during which time she also earned a master's degree, multitasking person, as we will learn. Elaine, you're the first female American sailor to spend your entire career on combat ships. You left the Navy and then ran for Congress and were elected to the House of Representatives from Virginia's 2nd District in 2018, beating the Republican incumbent, and then you beat him again by a larger margin in your re-election in 2020. You are married to a retired Navy commander, you have 2 stepchildren and a daughter born in 2009, and you reside in Norfolk. During the last year of your first term as a representative, even though you were a freshman member of Congress, you had the 3rd highest number among all your colleagues of bills signed into law by the president. Wow, wow. And 85% of the bills you sponsored or co-sponsored were bipartisan. I know you're extraordinarily busy and want to thank you so much, tell you how grateful I am that you accepted my invitation to join us today. I note that you have other obligations shortly after the end of our session, so we will only run over maybe by about 10 minutes. The way we'll organize it is for the first 45, 50 minutes, you and I will dialogue, and then the last 15 minutes or so, I will select questions. Our audience is encouraged to send any questions you would have for our guest on the chat function, and then we will try to include as many as possible. So it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce you, Congresswoman Elaine Luria. Thank you so much for being our speaker today. And let me start by asking you, a change of administrations, particularly when your party has won the election, is obviously a very exciting moment in Washington. Could you share with us your personal experience of these first few weeks of the Biden administration?
Well, certainly, and Patrick, thank you again for inviting me to join your group from all across Europe, and all the folks at Indian Springs who are watching. It's great that you were able to join us, and I guess you kind of only know what you know, and then when something changes, it's quite different. So when I came into Congress, I was elected in 2018. And what was a blue wave where Democrats took back control of the House, yet the Senate remained in Republican control. So like you mentioned in your introduction, it's really important to be able to thread that needle and be able to work through a process where you could build consensus and bipartisanship to actually get something done and signed into law. And I was able in my first term to actually get 10 bills signed into law, and that includes those that were incorporated, introduced separately, but incorporated into other legislation, such as the National Defense Authorization Act or the Defense Bill. And so, I think that in a new administration, where we have friends, allies, who share our values and are really trying to keep some of the same objectives, in the administration is, it's a different landscape. The fact that, today it's much easier to pick up the phone and call a cabinet secretary or the Secretary of Defense and talk about these issues and really be able to, approach them from a perspective legislatively, where I feel like we have more of a clear path forward. That said, the Senate, is under Democratic control, but with the tie-breaking vote of Vice President. And so, there's a very narrow path to accomplish things in the Senate. But, a lot of the work that I work on I'll mention my committee assignments. I serve on the Armed Services Committee. I'm actually the vice chair of the Armed Services Committee. And then I serve on the Veterans Affairs Committee, both very broadly bipartisan committees. And, typically well known for getting legislation done across the aisle, and regardless of which party controls the House, the Senate, or the White House. But I think it's a very different landscape under this administration, and the fact that we have so many ongoing challenges with the COVID pandemic and recovering the economy and getting the vaccine out. So a lot of the issues that we focus on, specifically in the Armed Services Committee, it's really important to be a voice to continue to highlight the importance of those. At the same time that the national focus is really on a lot of the domestic and human issues that are just absolutely necessary to come out of the COVID pandemic. So I think it'll be interesting learning the working dynamics under the new administration, and how we can push forward some of the priorities that are really necessary for the country.
That's exciting. We're gonna come back to some of those subjects, but since you're talking about committees, I'm sure particularly some of the students who are watching. And we have, by the way, we have students in Portugal as well who are on. How do you get on a committee? Who decides? Can you kind of indicate what you're interested in? Because committees are very powerful in the House, and which committee you get on. You recently, in addition to your being on the Armed Services and the Veterans Committee, you recently named the Homeland Security Committee, a very powerful committee as well. How does that work?
Yeah, well, so these are all things when you come in as a new member of Congress, you have to navigate your way through it. A lot of it is building relationships, talking to people, selling your experience, the fact that I was a 20-year Navy veteran and had that experience, and also the ties to my district. I describe a little bit the 2nd District in Virginia. It spans the entire coastline of Virginia. We have 8 major military installations, so every service is represented in Hampton Roads, the largest naval base in the world. 1/4 of all the shipbuilding and repair that happens in the entire country happens in Hampton Roads, and we build all of the aircraft carriers and half the submarines. So, it is a natural fit that someone from our region would serve on the Armed Services Committee, and specifically the Sea Power Subcommittee. My predecessor did not serve on that committee, but when I got to Congress, I immediately started advocating for an assignment to the Armed Services Committee, and there is a committee of other members of Congress called the Steering and Policy Committee. So there is consideration to the experience that people bring to Congress, the districts that they represent, and what things are important in those districts to have representation on the committees, and then geographic distribution of members. Like, you wouldn't want to have one committee where all members were from the same one or two states. So there is a process through Steering and Policy where you put in a request for the committees and justify, why you think you'd be a good person to serve on those committees. I was fortunate to get both of my first choices in the last Congress. So that was Armed Services and Veterans Affairs. And then this Congress, there was a need to fill some additional seats and to request a waiver to be on a 3rd committee. And that's when I requested Homeland Security. After the events of January 6th, I felt that the issues that Homeland Security would be addressing in the near term, such as domestic terrorism, extremism, were really important issues, and wanted to be able to be part of that discussion moving forward.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on being on that committee, and having 3 committees, even as just a 2nd term House member. Obviously, you are highly respected and admired by your colleagues, and that's shown. Since we're talking about the events of January 6th, obviously it's a really important subject, a major event. The whole world saw with dismay and horror the insurrection of January 6th. So maybe before talking about the consequences, I mean, you were there. And of course, you've been in combat situations many times in your career, but tell us a little bit, what was it like in terms of personal experience? Just how bad was it from the point of view of a House member?
Well, I'll start out by saying I was actually, at the Capitol in the Cannon office building, which is across the street. And, I think that all the members, felt that something was going to happen that day. A large portion of DC had been closed down. A lot of the streets with access to the Capitol, were closed off to vehicular traffic. And so I originally just, told all of my staff, except for one member, my team, just work from home. We've gotten used to that, during COVID. And so that was easy to shift to that. But, when I came in, almost immediately after I got to the office, we were told to evacuate the office building. And they had identified a pipe bomb, actually two of them in close vicinity to the House office buildings. And so, I didn't really immediately have a clear picture of what was going on across the street at the Capitol, but I evacuated my office to another colleague's office and was able to see the images on TV of what was happening across the street. So immediately, very afraid and concerned for my colleagues who I knew were on the House floor, the ones I could see, in pictures of what was happening, and trying to reach out to them and make sure that they got safely out of the Capitol. We were told to, basically shelter in place, to not move, not walk around the hallways, not make any noise. And we kind of stayed that way throughout, the remainder of the day until the evening when they had cleared the people, out of the Capitol. So, I think I had similar feelings of, every American who watched those images of people violently breaking the windows and storming the Capitol and, wearing clothes that, had, really just anti-Semitic and violent, rhetoric on them, the Camp Auschwitz, person who we saw in those photos, horrifyingly came to turn out later was from nearby where I live in Virginia. So, I think that it was a shock to everyone to see it, but I think that when you think about the preceding 4 years and all of the rhetoric and radicalization that had built up, it was shocking, but not actually surprising that the events turned violent that day. And I think what was most important on everyone's mind was, the safety of the people in the Capitol, the people who work in the Capitol, including staff and the press and the Capitol Police, and to get everything secured. But we had to go back and carry on with the process of certifying the election results. So I think it was, very important and a very powerful message that, we didn't go home until that was done. So I think it was 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, later that morning that we completed what we had gone there to do.
Yeah. We were all proud of all of you that you did go back and you did confirm the results of the election. I guess this naturally leads us to one of the main topics that I wanted to and I'm sure our audience wants to hear about, is the whole question of the risk and the threat of domestic terrorism in the US. Obviously, we saw it on January 6th. We see it in the news now every day, of fear of that. You're a member of the Homeland Security Committee. Homeland Security is responsible for both evaluating the risk, I assume, and trying to deal with it. Can you share with us your own assessment, both of the risk and what has to be done and what is likely to be done to deal with that risk?
Well, I think that quantifying the risk is difficult because of the fact that the extremism, the radicalization, the sort of propagation of lies that has become so prevalent, across social media, and even some, I wouldn't call it mainstream media, but actually largely distributed media outlets like OAN and other media outlets that purport to be credible news sources, that I think it's going to be really difficult to understand exactly how many people believe what in fact are lies about the election, and kind of have been keeping my eye on what polling data shows, the percentage of Republican voters who still believe that the election results were false, or that there was fraud in this election in 2020, is really concerning. And it's really concerning for how much faith the public has in our election process. And so I think that close examination of what happened on January 6th. There is formation ongoing, and the exact composition of it is not determined yet, to have a commission similar to a 9/11 commission that would thoroughly examine all of the events leading up to January 6th. Both those intelligence failures or lapses, or, we're talking about domestic terrorism. So, some of the same tools and things that we have available to monitor activities, people posing a foreign threat to the country are very different than what is allowed to, monitor activities that are domestic and of U.S. citizens. And so I think that is something that, complicates the task of, gathering and assessing the information. But, looking at January 6th, I think we need to look at, the things that fostered the misinformation campaign that, led people to be radicalized, that led them to carry out this violent action. And when you think about, say the several thousand people who gathered for the then president's speech, at the ellipse, and then the portion of them who marched over the Capitol and the several hundred who actually stormed through the doors of the Capitol, what factor do we multiply that by for the number of people across the country who actually share those same views? And what kind of actions does one take to promote the truth and facts rather than things that have been distorted through these conspiracy theories such as QAnon. So I mean, I think that will be one of the main focuses within the Homeland Security Committee, to look at the growth of domestic terrorism and radicalization. It's also a topic that we'll be discussing in the Veterans Affairs Committee, because and it's also being discussed in the Armed Services Committee, because a disproportionately large number of the people who participated in the activities on January 6th have been shown to either be, veterans, or even some people who are active in the National Guard today participated in that. So I think that, we can see that the Secretary of Defense has done a stand down basically, to readdress, people's oath of office, and root out or, just highlight the issues with extremism and the fact that it's not acceptable in our armed services. So I think that the work will actually overlap truly all three of the committees where I serve.
Of course, and I guess I have two types of questions. One is, as you pointed out, domestic terrorism is very different from tourism outside the United States, and issues of personal freedom, issues of the Bill of Rights and freedom of the press and freedom of ideas. Do you see some real difficulties in gathering the kind of domestic intelligence that needs to be gathered to be able to deal with the threat relative to, the foundation of the freedom that we have in this country? I guess that would be let me leave you with that first question, and then the second was totally different, so I'll come back to that one. Is that going to be a real problem? Are we going to be able to get the information we need, the intelligence we need, without running into serious obstacles in terms of the freedom that this country offers to its citizens?
I think that that's going to be a huge challenge, because, the fundamental tenets of our country, our democracy, freedom of speech, privacy rights, all of those things that are fundamental. It's difficult to then come up with means by which you can sort of surveil different types of activity without violating people's rights in that way. And obviously you have to have probable cause and a reason to search someone for something, or surveil them. And so, I think that will be a really difficult challenge to try to determine ways to identify these trends, these groups of people who organize and, incite this kind of activity. But, after looking at those people who've, been charged and or already arrested for the events on January 6th, there were some with 3 organizations who specifically operated in a coordinated way to, orchestrate this attack. But actually the majority of the people who've been charged or arrested operated independently, really with, no affiliation with a known group. They may have had loose affiliations amongst themselves. In some cases there were several family members who were arrested or, had a link to each other. But, the sort of domestic terrorist groups that have been identified actually did not represent the majority of the people who ended up at the Capitol on January 6th. So yes, I think that will be a huge challenge. And I think that it's incredibly important that we, protect people's right to free speech and right to practice.
I mean,
at the same time, we got to counter this threat. So it is, how we're going to move forward to do that.
It's going to be difficult. When you look at the reaction of the United States after 9/11 and some of the excesses that have been carried out after that horrible event, one can only be a little fearful of the possible excessive reaction to domestic terrorism. But we all saw those pictures on January 6th, and it's clear that we have to deal with getting the information and not only punishing those people who committed crimes that day, but also trying to root out some of the causes. that may lead to further domestic terrorism. And I guess that leads me to another question is once you identify these people, once you identify just how broadly it is diffused, some of the lies that you mentioned, what can we do about it? Obviously, there's no easy answer, but in your discussion with your colleagues and others in Washington, what are some of the ideas that are being developed to how we're going to, once we do know a little better, get the information, how are we going to deal with it? We can't put everybody in jail. We need to deal somewhere with the root causes of the threat of domestic terrorism. So what are some of the ideas that are being discussed in Washington?
I one of the main discussions that has been had or is ongoing is a campaign against disinformation. I think that what leads in a large part to, the radicalization, or even in kind of a very dangerous way to the belief of a large number of people across the country that, President Trump won the election, which is absolutely not true. And there are no facts that justify that. Is that there really is no method by which people can understand whether the facts they're receiving are true or not. So, we've talked a lot about the role of social media in this, whether Twitter and Facebook, they did try to implement controls that, basically flag items that, may not be true. But it's a question about, how much do people, regard that, or do those kind of things actually embolden then sort of inflate the information even more amongst people, who want to be told that, basically who want to be told that, what they're saying is a lie in order to say that the other side is lying. I know that sounds very convoluted, but like it's like some of the members of the House of Representatives right now. I mean, there's a woman who joined this Congress from Georgia named Marjorie Taylor Greene. I don't know if the word of her has made it all the way across the Atlantic, but I'm sure the folks watching.
Oh yes.
From her. But kind of one of the most challenging things with people who take the approach that she's taking is she's actually emboldened by criticism of her inflammatory rhetoric. So you almost are kind of stuck in a catch-22, because if you condemn what she's doing, she takes that and actually uses it to amplify her voice even more. And so I think that cycle happens, kind of within these circles of people who want to promote this type of information. So I would think that the kind of most concrete thing, even though I don't know that we've found tangible solutions for it, is to address some of the issues related to disinformation. So that's one thing I'm aware of that's being talked about moving forward.
I don't know whether you've seen this well-known conservative pundit, William Crystal, published a commentary, I think yesterday morning, in which he warned that American democracy is in crisis. And he said, the fact that so many people, including the ex-president, are propagating the lie that he won the election is really serious, and it's the first time in history that we don't have a peaceful transfer of power. First time in history that there's a real question about the peaceful transfer of power. And I mean, in a way, you've already answered the question, but let me repeat it, because I thought the fact that here we had this very conservative, well-known conservative commentator, William Crystal, saying, democracy is threatened by these developments, truly threatened, and our democracy appears to be much more fragile than any one of us would have thought just a few years ago. Do you share that view, and what is your reaction to that comment?
Well, I certainly share the view that it's more fragile than I would have thought or acknowledged prior to the events in the last 2 months. And I'll say that anecdotally, people would say to me a couple years ago, I think he's going to refuse to leave office, and I think we're going to have a riot, and I think we're going to have a civil war. I could understand that the place that was coming from in them was angst or anxiety or just really fear. But I didn't really put any sort of credibility on it. Like I thought, I empathized with their feelings that led them to that, but I didn't really think that we would ever get there. We would ever see a mob, storming the US Capitol. But, all of the things kept building up. And as we saw events unfolding, my colleagues in Michigan would talk about the things that were happening in Lansing and these armed groups. In Virginia, we had Charlottesville. And then in Virginia, we also frequently, every year have protests, which remain peaceful, but outside the Capitol in Richmond, where people come heavily armed, and that is their, right to carry weapons and to openly carry them in Virginia under our laws. But, just that people being so emboldened to kind of bring this sort of potentially violent rhetoric to it, and then tie Michigan and Virginia together. There was a plot to kidnap and execute the governors of both Michigan, and then they found out later that our governor of Virginia was part of that. So, all of these pieces started coming together to show that, something that may have been hypothetical or people just had a bad sense about, angst about, was coming to more of a reality. And what I'd say with where we sit today is, I think that the president and the people who emboldened him and the people who continue to embolden him are what our real threat is. The fact that so many members of the House voted to reject the election results of the two states, even after the mob stormed the Capitol, is really disconcerting. And the fact that, there are so many elected members of government at every level, it's federal, state, local officials, who are blatantly continuing to disregard the facts, spread lies. We saw the large conference that the Republicans have in Florida, the CPAC conference this weekend. And, again, that was just filled with, and continued inflammatory rhetoric. So, I think that the real threat is, allowing the former president to continue to have a mouthpiece, and those people, especially other elected officials who continue to reinforce his rhetoric and the lies. And I'll say with you, I'm not an overly partisan person. I spent 20 years in the military. When you're on active duty, there are three things they say you don't talk about in the wardroom. That's religion, sex, and politics. So, you don't talk, politics is not something that, as a naval officer, you spend a lot of time, talking about. And you certainly don't ask anyone who works for you what their political affiliation is. And, even under President Trump, I had the ability to work across the aisle and get 10 bills signed into law. I went to executive order signings at the White House and literally stood behind the president when it was something I believed in. But, I think that this is really, it's gone too far because we've gone beyond just partisanship and difference on issues. I think we've truly gone to a point where there is a threat to our democracy. And I think that my colleagues in the House, really need to stand up. I just don't understand the grasp that he has on other elected officials, that they can't see the truth and speak that way. And, I'm very proud of some of my colleagues, like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who did stand up, who did vote for the impeachment. And there are many more who may not have voted for the impeachment, who were in favor of a censure, but, also did not take any votes to overturn the election. And I'm going to seek to reach out and work even more closely with, those people, a lot of whom I had already been working with in the last Congress.
Yeah, I wrote a book this year explaining the U.S. election system before the election. And because of what was going on and because of what Trump was saying about his not, he's told us ahead of time he wasn't going to accept the election if he lost. And I added the last chapter, What Could Go Wrong? And in that chapter, I did not dare think what could really go wrong. So I kind of said, well, this is what he said, but actually it's going to be fine. I wrote, and it isn't fine at all. And I guess I'm just echoing what you've said, is that we're going to have to grasp with the reality that, our usual assumption that somehow or other American democracy and the way it works is going to overcome these difficulties and everything's going to be okay in the final analysis. Well, the reality is we can no longer think that way, and we really do have to act differently in a way that we don't yet know. I don't see very clearly what is going to happen, what is the outcome. I don't know whether you see perhaps more clearly.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball to see into the future. I'm hopeful, that this, I would say that, the vast majority of Americans will reject this ideology, that the Republican Party will go back to its core foundation and, it'll at some point in the future, it's hard to envision today that, we'll be back to debating policy nuances and not the volatile rhetoric that, consumes every political discussion today. And it's just amazing how there's flat out lies in the process. I mean, as a member of Congress, it's interesting kind of how the process works and, kind of seeing what you get attacked for. And, I can get attacked for voting on something that didn't even exist. And I know I don't want to get into nuances of procedural votes, but there's things called motions to recommit. We kind of changed that process this Congress. And so now the Republicans don't really have a way to, it doesn't matter Republican or Democrat, the minority party doesn't really have a way to put you on the record for something that they didn't get in the bill. So now they just make it up. Because they don't have a way to put it on the record, they literally just make it up. And then they can say, well, had you let us put an amendment in the bill or, pass the previous question, which is a procedural vote before we start the process on voting on something, this is what we would have brought to the floor. So because you voted for something else, that's great. And we all voted for it too. But because you didn't do this procedural vote to kill that at the beginning, you voted to keep schools closed. You don't want our children back in school. I mean, it's like ridiculous. I never took a vote on that, but they can say it and no one disputes it. And it's just kind of absurd, how it's conflated to not be based off of any sort of facts.
So we're going to have to somehow or other redo things in a clearer way with truth being respected more than it is today. Let me, if I may, completely change the subject and approach a subject that certainly people who live in Europe are extremely sensitive to. You are one of the 4 co-chairs of the New Democratic Coalition Climate Change Task Force. And you've received a 97% positive grade by the National Environmental Scorecard. Congratulations. So, one of the biggest differences between the previous administration and the current one is President Biden has put fighting climate change front and center in the agenda of everything this administration is going to do. Could you share with us your feeling, what is the future, both in terms of the US position and in terms of international cooperation? We know, of course, that Biden has rejoined the Paris agreements, but, international cooperation in regards to this objective and how it's going to work into the fiber of US society and US economic policies.
Yes, well, I definitely think it's a shift in perspective from the previous administration to this administration. And, I was in favor of rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. And I'll just talk a little bit about, kind of how I approach issues related to climate change. In our area, so in coastal Virginia, there's no dispute about sea level rise and recurrent flooding. I mean, we're in a situation, truly, I mentioned earlier, the 8 major military installations we have in Hampton Roads, where the effects of climate change, sea level rise and recurrent flooding are a national security issue. They affect access to the bases and really the long-term viability of the majority of our Navy on the East Coast to be able to continue to operate in the region, or really any coastal region, because of the impacts on the infrastructure. So, there is no dispute, and it's not a partisan issue where we are in Virginia, that, the sea level rise and recurrent flooding, or the use of the word climate change, is not really disputed. And so, kind of the reason I wanted to join as one of the co-chairs on the climate change task force was to make sure, especially within the Democratic caucus, where often people overlook the defense implications of things, that I was a strong voice about the implications on our national defense of climate change. And if you look at DoD's recent study of the impacts of climate change on military installations, 3 of the top 10 in the country are right in our district. So it has a large impact on that. And so I wanted to make sure to be a clear voice for that. And another thing that I was very opposed to was, starting new leases for offshore drilling on the East Coast. There had been a long ongoing discussion. The president early in his administration excluded Florida, but the other parts of the East Coast, including, where we are in the mid-Atlantic, it was still open for the possibility of offshore drilling. So we've been very strongly behind, investing in greener, cleaner technology and not further investments in, seeking increased, oil drilling off of our coast and opening us up to some of the other vulnerabilities, such as the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf. We also, rely a lot on a pristine environment, our coast, for, not only travel and tourism with, the beaches, but also the Chesapeake Bay, aquaculture, fisheries, those types of things. So all of the environmental implications of further exploration of oil in our immediate geographic area. And on a bipartisan basis, every city and county on the coast of Virginia, unanimously, their city council or board of supervisors voted against, allowing offshore drilling. And at the state level, the Commonwealth of Virginia had started to put in place, measures that would prevent activities in state waters, but yet it was still in federal waters that could have, allowed the offshore drilling. So, standing up against an increased exploration for fossil fuels. And, I think we're in a situation now, and this is back to our previous answer of the question of like disinformation, so the idea that, President Biden's attempt to go to greener, cleaner energy, cut CO2 emissions and fight climate change is an attempt to like kill good paying American jobs. And that's where the Republicans are taking kind of everything with, any of the pipelines that have been canceled and different things like that. So, I think that we need to, we can't immediately overnight go to all renewable energy. And there's, obvious reasons for that. The technology is lacking, the investment is great. And even our infrastructure, as far as our power grids and other things in order to support, switching to renewable energies, it's going to take years to develop. So I think that, our priority needs to be to come up with a pragmatic plan where we can phase in and take advantage of those new technologies, over a reasonable period of time. We are not seeking offshore or drilling off the coast of Virginia, yet we are underway developing the largest offshore wind project in the US and the first in federal waters. So the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has set aside 144,000 acres off the coast of Virginia. And the first test turbines and all of the kind of development that's necessary to lead to a very large scale offshore wind project is underway. And there's actually about 14 along the East Coast from North Carolina north that are being developed right now to take advantage of the possibilities of offshore wind. And kind of the third thing that I've really been promoting, and this might be because, in the Navy, I was a nuclear engineer and operated nuclear reactors on aircraft carriers. But, I think that we need to consider the use of nuclear and specifically advanced nuclear. And we're looking at, the future of energies and ways to cut CO2 emissions. The wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. And so you don't always have that ability to maintain the base load that you need to do for electrical power and distribution. And, we're just not at a point where battery technology can make up for that. So I think that investing in advanced nuclear is very important. I introduced legislation in the House. Senator Murkowski has introduced the Senate called the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act. And various portions of that legislation did pass through the appropriations process over the last 2 years to be able to fund some real investments by the federal government in developing prototype reactors and new types of advanced nuclear. So I think there's a lot of pieces to this. I mean, I think that, we need to look at policies, through energy packages that we pass, infrastructure bills that, can all support a shift to greener, cleaner energy, and then the technology investments that go behind that to be able to, help with the research and development to promote those new technologies that are going to drive our energy in that direction.
Interesting. A lot of ideas, a lot of good ideas are being bandied about. And I guess that leads me to another subject that you've alluded to a bit, but let's talk a little more about it, is the increased partisanship in Congress and in America to begin with, and specifically in Congress. And I mean, I'm struck by the fact that the Biden administration is proposing a number of major new initiatives, including on climate change, including on immigration, including on voters' rights, including a major infrastructure initiative. And you take each of those and possibly one or two others, and the majority of Americans, in fact, frequently a large majority of Americans, are favorable to these initiatives. And in fact, most of these initiatives, a majority of Republicans are favorable to them. And yet the Republicans in Congress are, if we can take the example of the $1.9 trillion COVID, I forget the exact name of it, COVID bill, American Rescue Plan, all of the Republicans in the House voted against it, and it looks highly likely that all of the Republican senators will vote against it. So, I mean, I guess the two questions I would love your opinion on is, you know, is there any chance that the Biden administration can get some of these things passed? And you know, what do we do about the gridlock that results from increased partisanship and this you know, seemingly difficult to understand. I mean, we know the reasons for it, but difficult to understand of the Republicans in Congress absolutely not reflecting even their own party in terms of the public, and whether you think that's going to evolve in a way that can help us imagine that the administration can move forward on some of these issues.
Yes, so I think that it was discouraging, you know, for me and what I would say is a group of other, you know, moderate Democrats in the House, you know, to go from the inspiring message that President Biden gave at the inauguration of unity to the fact that there was going to be no unity because no matter what we did, the Republicans were going to be obstinate and not working together on a forthcoming COVID package. And granted, you know, over the summer, we had several of these bills, which were called HEROES and HEROES 2, which were sweeping large COVID relief packages that, you know, had kind of everything but the kitchen sink in them. And there was a lot of necessary things in there. And there were a lot of things in there that, you know, would have made good law, but didn't belong in a COVID package. And, you know, I actually voted against both of those HEROES bills, although, you know, I voted against both of them because I knew that there was absolutely no chance that the Senate under, you know, Leader McConnell was going to take them up and they were ever going to become law. I am part of a bipartisan caucus called the Problem Solvers Caucus. We're actually the largest bipartisan caucus in the House. So there's 48 members, equal number of Democrats and Republicans. And, you know, forging that alliance in the House and working with a group of our Senate colleagues, we were actually able to work together and come up with a framework that developed ultimately the final COVID package that passed in the Trump administration. So, you know, I think that there is a framework to work together and work on these types of issues in a bipartisan and bicameral way. And we have the framework and mechanism to do that. I'm also part of another bipartisan caucus called the Four Country Caucus, which is all veterans. And that has been an effective tool to work on some of these issues related to, you know, the military families, veterans, those types of issues. But these, you know, big packages, and we have working groups within the caucus, you know, starting over again this Congress to address these issues, you know, such as, you know, infrastructure, environmental issues, climate change. And I'm going to be part of the infrastructure task force for that group. And so, you know, truly, I think that that is what's necessary. And, you know, we're in a situation where we're kind of in a race to April 1st to repass all of the legislation that was passed last Congress, all of which was, you know, all of the legislation that the House passed that, you know, didn't actually pass the Senate. So, you know, you hear this notional list of, you know, 400 bills that sat on Senator McConnell's desk and never moved anywhere. So kind of picking out some of those key bills, the single digit bills like HR 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, the high priority for leadership bills. And so I think you'll see between now and April 1st that, you know, a lot of that legislation is going to get passed again in the same form, essentially, that it was passed last Congress. But the truth is, you know, with the Senate, very narrow majority in the Senate, I would say there's even, you know, reliably 2 Democratic senators who would vote against a lot of this legislation. So we are going to have to, at some point, you know, be able to come together on these important issues and actually parse out the elements of this legislation that everyone can support. So that's, you know, really where I think a caucus, a bipartisan caucus like the Problem Solvers, and some people might, you know, kind of know of the liaison with the Senate as no labels, you know, kind of working together with that group of senators is kind of the path to be able to do that. And it might not always be the same people on all issues, but, you know, it definitely takes, you know, enough people. That's why when I, you know, co-sponsor legislation or introduce legislation, I rarely do it without a bipartisan you know, partner to introduce legislation. I think in the last Congress, I was around 85% of my legislation was bipartisan. And, you know, I'll continue to attempt to do that because, you know, it's more meaningful, I think, if it actually has a chance of becoming law. And you can already build that partnership again across the aisle from the start. So, you know, when I tell people about the Problem Solvers, hopefully it is, you know, somewhat hopeful, and especially the fact that, you know, we were able to, you know, really exert some influence in the most recent COVID package that did become law with our Senate colleagues. So, you know, that's kind of at least my effort to continue to work.
Good. There's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. Well, maybe maybe you could address specifically. I mean, there's one subject there where Republicans, even in Congress, have indicated that they are very favorable to a part of Democratic proposals. Is the subject of the major infrastructure bill. Do you think that's likely in this Congress?
I think that there's a big appetite to do an infrastructure bill. You know, I think that it's hard to understand kind of how Republicans in the Senate, like how amenable they would be to doing an infrastructure bill, because, you know, we do require 60 votes, so it would take 10 Republican members of the Senate and the ability to work together on something that comprehensive, where we could, you know, build it from the start in a way that the Republicans in the Senate would also be willing to support it. Is, you know, kind of where my question mark comes in. You know, the $1.9 trillion package that we're doing right now for the you know, pending COVID relief package is being done under budget reconciliation. There's actually the possibility of doing that more than once this year. So, you know, I don't know anything firm, but, you know, kind of some of these other things may be potential things to be able to do under a budget reconciliation process later, where only 51 votes would be required in the Senate. And then, you know, even legislation that can pass that way, there's some, you know, very moderate Democrats in the Senate who would probably not support something as ambitious as the House as a whole would be able to pass. So there'll still be compromise required. But, you know, I think that infrastructure, and, you know, when we talk infrastructure now, one of the things that's really been highlighted during the COVID pandemic is it's not just bridges, right? It's not just roads, bridges, tunnels, ports, airports, harbors, but also broadband, and the fact that, you know, the lack of, you know, broadband in a lot of our rural communities and underserved areas of our urban communities has really exacerbated, you know, some of the issues that we already knew existed before COVID, but, you know, really, I think it's like the electrification of the US, you know, everyone should have, you know, electricity, but now, you know, just to be able to, you know, sort of survive in our modern environment, they also need access to the internet. So I think that is a big driving thing. I mean, rural broadband has been a very bipartisan issue. So I'm optimistic, I guess I'll say, that we can get that.
Good. Okay, I hope you're right, Elaine, and I mean, you know, the fact you are an exception to the general rule. I mean, 85% of the bills that you have promoted have been bipartisan, which is certainly a very commendable record, and I hope you can continue that in this Congress as well. Let me start looking at some of the questions. I see my good friend Jose Karp, who is president of the Jewish community in Lisbon, and in fact told me, he's a good friend, he told me he would love to meet you next time he's in Washington. And you, of course, are a Jewish member of Congress. He has a question on the international front and asked whether the relationship, the tension in the relationship between this administration and Saudi Arabia might have a negative impact on some of the agreements that have been reached with UAE, Bahrain, and other that may be in process with other Arab states. Do you see that the difficulties in the relationship between U.S. and Saudi is going to have a big impact in terms of the Middle East and our government's policy in that area?
Well, you know, first of all, I would say that, you know, it is the things that were accomplished during the last administration, you know, as far as creating alliances within the Middle East, the Abraham Accords, I think was a positive move forward. And I think that that's, you know, we shouldn't look back on the last administration and say everything that happened was bad, because I certainly think that, you know, the ability to forge some of those alliances, you know, between countries in the Middle East is definitely a bright spot. You know, I think that the new report that came out, you know, about the involvement in the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, you know, there's a lot of, you know, cries to condemn, obviously must condemn the murder, condemn the human rights violations, you know, condemn, you know, what was done, but what are the, you know, follow-on implications? You know, are there, you know, sanctions? Do we stop cooperation militarily? You know, stop arms sales? There were conversations, you know, and actually legislation in the last Congress that addressed, you know, Saudi's involvement in the crisis that's ongoing in Yemen. You know, so Saudi Arabia has been an ally. I think it's important geographically for us to be able to maintain access and, the ability to work with the Saudis to protect some of our security interests in the Middle East. But, I'd say it's always been a difficult relationship as well, because, this is not the first time that, we've questioned, some of their actions or motives. So I think that the fact that the Biden administration did not immediately rush to take any type of action that would sever ties with Saudi Arabia, I think is a signal that we are going to need to find a way to both condemn these actions, the Saudi involvement in these actions, but recognizing that it's a delicate balance in the Middle East, and we're going to have to do that behind the backdrop of the fact that we need to be able to not alienate someone who has been an ally. I don't know if I don't want to put too many qualifiers on it. Someone who's important for us to be able to continue to work with in the region. So I think how we address this could sort of shift the balance or tip it in a direction that might not be favorable. So I think that's why there wasn't a rush by the administration to immediately take action. But there are quite a few things being introduced in the House, that in various ways condemn Saudi involvement and, go the gamut of, just resolutions of condemnation all the way to, complete severing of ties and stopping any sort of arms sales or military or intelligence cooperation. So I think that how that's handled will be very important to the balance of our alliances in the region as we go forward in the next months or years.
Okay. Well, you mentioned nuclear power as part of the contribution to the fight against climate change. We have a question from a gentleman who's asking, what about green hydrogen? Is there discussion about the use of hydrogen, and is there some let's say, movement in Congress to push, Congress and the administration, to push hydrogen as part of a solution of a carbon-free society?
What I would say is that I think the legislation that we need to do going forward, it truly needs to sort of be technology neutral in the sense that, all of the technologies that can contribute to providing energy without CO2 emissions need to be considered and invest in the research and development of that type of technology. And as it becomes mature, incentivize, use of that technology as part of the mix of kind of what our energy future looks like. So, I'm not specifically aware of provisions related to hydrogen, but I think that I'll just say I think they're out there, and kind of all of the things that seek to promote different types of renewable energy.
Okay, there's another question on related the subject on nuclear energy, the concern of storage of radioactive waste as a problem with regard to existing atomic energy plants, nuclear plants, and other use of atomic energy, and obviously a concern also for the continuation of the development of nuclear energy as an alternative source. What are your thoughts on what is being done, what should be done in terms of dealing with nuclear waste?
Yes, well, I mean, we can recognize that this is an ongoing problem. A lot of money was, put into the development of Yucca Mountain, and that facility has not, come online to accept nuclear waste from our existing power plants. So we actually have, nuclear waste being stored, at different facilities around the country. And I think that, when I talk about advanced nuclear, we're not really talking about building the same 1960s technology pressurized water reactors. I think that advanced nuclear involves new and different types of fuel, high assay LEU fuel, which is low enriched uranium, which has much lower radioactivity of the waste products. And then there's actually abilities to take existing expended fuel and reprocessing that fuel to develop new types of fuel, which at the same time, can deal with some of the waste issues and be used in development of, future types of reactors. So, cannot ignore that fact that, there is the waste to be dealt with. And I think that that's something we need to look at moving forward. I mean, the Navy, for example, has, ever since the beginning of the Naval Nuclear Power Program, been able to safely store their waste in Idaho Falls, Idaho. And I think it's a question, with this type of waste, there are not a lot of people looking to invite to have it in their backyard, but I think you can look at, other places in the US, for example, and in the world where there have been storage facilities that have been created that can safely store it, over, the long term. It is feasible, and we do have to come to a solution with that. So I agree that it's something that has to be talked about in the discussion, but I think that the waste generated from advanced nuclear, the different types of technology be considered is much less of a long-term concern than the current types of reactor technology that we have been using over the last 5 or 6 decades.
Okay, we have a question from Charles Buchanan, who a longtime member of the American Club and was president at one time, on a subject that I know will be dear to your heart. He says, Portugal was known historically as a maritime power, it's a maritime country. Obviously, that has evolved, and the youth of today in Portugal and perhaps elsewhere don't put maritime studies as a high priority. In the United States, are maritime studies something that is prestigious, and should we, as I know what your answer will be, should we do more in that area because it's so important for the world, the whole field of maritime studies and the sea as a source of potential both economic and continued political importance.
So we should have scheduled an entire another hour or two for this discussion, and we could have gone back and reflected on, Mahan and the influence of sea power on history and those types of things. But and I'll say that, the one time I had the pleasure of visiting Lisbon was on a port visit on the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise in about 2008. So I have come there and I have come by the sea. So, I think that it's a very valid point that, we have overlooked the importance of the Navy and the maritime strategy, of the US. When we look at, issues that we're dealing with in the Western Pacific and the South China Sea with China, this is truly a, maritime environment. And we, I think as a nation, have not really invested, not just invested monetarily, but invested emotionally and ideologically in the fact that, the defense of our country relies on the sea and access from the sea and investment in our future fleet. The current requirement for the Navy in law is to have 11 aircraft carriers and 355 ships. The last administration put out an even more ambitious plan that had us go well above 500 ships, including unmanned vessels. I think my role on the Sea Power Subcommittee, and now I serve on the Readiness Subcommittee on Armed Services, is really looking at and evaluating how we can make these bigger investments in our fleet, not just to have more ships, but really to ensure our national security against, malign actors around the world. We not only have, the Chinese activity in the South China Sea, where we need increased U.S. naval presence. We're still confronting issues in the Gulf, where we have been maintaining recently again a continuous presence of an aircraft carrier. We have increased Russian activity of submarines in North Atlantic. We have a lot going on, and we have a shipbuilding industrial base that has not been sustained to keep up and build at the same rate that the Chinese are building. So then getting back to the question of maritime studies, the maritime industry, kind of everything maritime, our region centers around that. And I think that we need to do a lot to reinvigorate and increase the capacity of our maritime industrial base. Our U.S. flag shipping, and specifically for the purpose of strategic sea lift. There is a program called the Maritime Security Program that keeps U.S. flag merchant vessels available for transporting U.S. cargo in times of war. And the strategic sea lift fleet also needs to be recapitalized. So I think we need to continue to invest in those. And then there's a mariner shortage as well. If you look at the number of mariners who currently, because the Jones Act requires U.S. mariners to operate U.S. flag vessels. And so the number of mariners, licensed mariners in the U.S. who are actively sailing is well below that number to activate our full strategic sea lift fleet, plus the number of vessels who operate under the U.S. flag and the Jones Act. So I think there's a lot more required in building our maritime industry. And both on the industrial side as well as the seafaring side, for the interest of our national defense and, for commerce. So I'll stop there because I really could go on about this topic for a very long time.
Okay.
Yes, I think that we're probably on the same page of the, importance of this sea power and, kind of being a maritime nation. And the last thing I'll say is, that I truly think that the Navy needs to do a lot more to sell itself to the importance of our country. If you think about NASA and how the entire country united behind the vision of putting a man on the moon, and today NASA's their slogan they're using today and kind of aspiring to is to put the first woman and the next man on the moon. So there's something to aspire to as a country. And I think when we think about our military, we don't necessarily pivot to the ability to project diplomacy and power overseas. You think of an aircraft carrier and kind of what that image and vision is for our country when faced with our adversaries such as the Chinese.
But Portugal has a very clear consciousness of the importance of the sea in terms of the development of Portugal. One of my good friends, Stefan Moraes, a venture capitalist, is creating a VC fund for new ideas specifically limited to the sea, related to the sea in Portugal. That's an area where Portugal and the US can do more together, I believe, and certainly we would encourage that. If we can contribute to that, we would do so we would welcome that. Let me pass on, since we're talking about the military, considering your experience with policy formulation regarding the military, what's your current thinking on the application of AI in the military, on artificial intelligence? Another huge subject. And
it is a huge subject. I would say that, it's not an area where I have a huge amount of expertise. I just, an understanding of the fact that we need to invest in the type of research that will keep us, on par and ahead of any potential adversaries that we have. I guess I think it's incredibly important. And, I have focused my attention more on, building ships and aircraft and defensive missiles and submarines and those types of things, and haven't really had the opportunity to dig in specifically to the uses of AI technology. And so I think I'll take a pass on, any specifics about it, other than saying that I know within Armed Services, we actually split out the subcommittees this year to create an additional subcommittee to address specifically these types of issues. So we split out the intelligence subcommittee from a separate one to do with, cybersecurity and technology issues, because I think that there was a feeling that this had not been directly addressed in enough depth in the past. And so, although I'm not serving on that subcommittee, I do have a group of colleagues who are focusing on this issue directly.
Given the threat of domestic terrorism, do you support expansion of Patriot Act type of legislation? And part of that question is, it would seem that the Patriot Act has been, let's say, criticized by frequently targeting Black and brown residents in terms of its application in the United States. Is there, a way to de-radicalize extremists and still protect all of our citizens? It's a little bit the same question that you addressed earlier, but with a particular question on the Patriots Act.
I think that's along the lines of what we were discussing earlier. And, I would have to consider any specific legislation that was, introduced, and would definitely be skeptical of things that I think would, infringe on people's civil liberties and right to free speech, or target, any particular group of people. Even when I say group of people, disproportionately impact a group of people based off of, factors that were, not related to their malign activity. So I would have to take a look at it. As you mentioned in the conversation a little bit earlier, kind of the effects of the post 9/11 legislation that passed, and criticism of things like the Patriot Act were seen by many as an overstep. And so we'd have to just look really carefully if there is anything proposed that kind of seems like that in addressing domestic terrorism in today's environment.
Okay, let me close by a question that I have.
Okay.
And it's really for the young people. who are watching today is, can you share with us, Elaine, what are some of the things about your job as a politician that you really like?
Mm.
And then, what are some of the things that you don't like? What are some of the things? So, for someone who is in high school in America or in Europe, and lucky to be sharing this conversation, what are some of the things that should lead people to want to get to have the kind of job you have? And what are some of the things that, are a little less attractive about the kind of work you do?
Yes. Well, I would say that, as bitter and unpleasant as some of the, partisan bickering that can go on in Washington, that I really get, the most rewarding feeling out of the job from the things we do for constituents in the district. We haven't touched much on that, but I think the job of being a representative goes well beyond things that we do in committee hearings or things that we vote on as far as legislation. And the fact that, in our district, 750,000 people who live in each congressional district, have the opportunity to really be a resource to connect those people with the federal government. And so we have a whole team of people who are caseworkers, and they help people with things from Social Security to Medicare, VA, immigration issues. And, when I hear the stories back from my team about things that we have been able to do to help individual people, especially during COVID, because it has been so challenging, economically, financially for people and small businesses, to just know that we're able to, sometimes provide that lifeline to people for something that they really need to get by. I'll give an example. A woman reached out to us, and her husband was deceased about 2 years ago. And because of an administrative error, she's never been able to figure out why she did not continue to receive his Social Security benefits as his surviving spouse. And as time went on and she had depleted all of her savings, she got to the point where she just didn't know what else to do. So she reached out to our office, and within a matter of a week or two, we were able to resolve this issue, recoup tens of thousands of dollars of Social Security benefits that she should have received. And she was literally on the verge of being evicted from her home and literally not being able to pay for her groceries. And when there's something like that where we can, help a person in the community, those kind of things are very rewarding. I think personally, it has allowed me to get out and go places and see things and experience things and meet new people who I would have never thought that I could meet, and just have a great appreciation for, how every single person in our community contributes in a great way to making our community and our country what it is. So I've really, had an opportunity to meet a lot of people I would have just never had an opportunity to meet, whether that's, people in small towns or pastors at churches that I would have never gone to, or, just hearing people's very heartfelt, stories about what's important to them, and then being able to take that back and try to do something with it to help people has been, very rewarding. And I think that's what I'd say I like the most about the job. What do I like the least? Well, I count myself lucky because I only have to drive 3 hours back and forth to DC. So I don't have to get on a plane and fly, 1,000 miles, to get back and forth. But, I would say that, and this could be the case for this job or, a lot of other jobs that, are related to public service, is that, these kind of things really do have a strain on your family. And, it is hard, as a woman and a mother, to be able to go off and do something like this, and have to put that burden on my family of being gone. And obviously a great support in my husband, who has allowed me to be able to do this. But it's definitely always a challenge. And the military was the same way. That kind of establishing what folks call work-life balance is, between having a family and also being able to pursue work that I find is very important and meaningful. So I would say that's probably been the toughest part of it, is just the fact that it's not easy. And then to get attacked that you're quote unquote doing this for personal gain, when you actually realize that there's other people who are, taking the brunt of the effect of you doing a job where you're gone so much, and it takes, so much of your time and attention is just almost ironic. But the perennial political attacks will continue. So, yeah, and I guess the last thing is, you kind of, and probably I got probably 80% of the way there in the Navy, but the rest of the way of developing a thick skin you know, they're going to attack you for everything, no matter what, if you're in politics. So you just got to do the right thing because, you know, it's the right thing, and not, you know, give in to what the political attack could be for any action you take.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Elaine. And let me share with you, one of the nicest parts of my job is spending an hour with someone as interesting and as and as just wonderful as Elaine Luria. So Elaine, thank you so much on behalf of everyone who attended. It's been a really interesting hour. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And, good luck to you with all these challenges that you have before you. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to join. And, it's just been great to spend an hour with you talking about these important and timely issues.
Great. Okay. Good luck to you, Elaine. Take care.
Bye.